Judge mocks old man in court, then realizes he's a legend fighting for justice. The gavel struck, sharp and final, silencing the murmurs in the New York County courthouse. An old man stood alone at the defendant's table, his sweater worn, his hands steady. "Trespassing, Your Honor," the prosecutor scoffed. Then he spoke. The deep, commanding voice shattered the room. Laughter died. Recognition set in. If you believe respect isn't measured by wealth, comment 1. If you think money determines worth, comment 0. Morgan Freeman stood before them, his presence unassuming yet unshaken. His weathered hands rested on the polished table, his face unreadable. To the judge, to the prosecutor, to the snickering spectators, he was nothing more than an aging trespasser who had wandered where he didn't belong. Judge Robert Calloway exhaled, adjusting his glasses as he flipped through the case file. A waste of time. "Trespassing," the prosecutor, Ethan Barker, repeated, his voice dripping with confidence. He stepped forward, addressing the jury as though the outcome had already been decided. The defendant ignored multiple warnings and unlawfully entered private property. Security footage confirms this beyond doubt. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is as simple as it gets. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery. The bailiff smirked. The stenographer stifled a laugh. Judge Calloway leaned forward unimpressed. "Sir, do you even understand the charges against you?" The courtroom buzzed with low whispers, amusement lingering in the air. Then he spoke. "Your Honor." It wasn't just words, it was a shift in the atmosphere. The voice, deep, rich, and impossibly familiar, rolled through the room, swallowing the laughter in an instant. The prosecutor's smirk faltered. The judge's fingers stopped drumming. The spectators sat up straighter. Because they knew that voice. And suddenly they realized this was no ordinary man. What happened next left the entire room speechless. Morgan Freeman stood before them, his presence unassuming yet unshaken. His weathered hands rested on the polished table, his face unreadable. To the judge, to the prosecutor, to the snickering spectators, he was nothing more than an aging trespasser who had wandered where he didn't belong. Judge Robert Calloway exhaled, adjusting his glasses as he flipped through the case file. A waste of time. "Trespassing," the prosecutor, Ethan Barker, repeated, his voice dripping with confidence. He stepped forward, addressing the jury as though the outcome had already been decided. The defendant ignored multiple warnings and unlawfully entered private property. Security footage confirms this beyond doubt. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is as simple as it gets. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery. The bailiff smirked. The stenographer stifled a laugh. Judge Calloway leaned forward, unimpressed. "Sir, do you even understand the charges against you?" The courtroom buzzed with low whispers, amusement lingering in the air. Then he spoke. "Your Honor." It wasn't just words, it was a shift in the atmosphere. The voice, deep, rich, and impossibly familiar, rolled through the room, swallowing the laughter in an instant. The prosecutor's smirk faltered. The judge's fingers stopped drumming. The spectators sat up straighter. Because they knew that voice. And suddenly they realized this was no ordinary man. What happened next left the entire room speechless. The silence stretched thick and heavy. For a moment, the New York County Courthouse seemed frozen in time. Every breath held, every movement stilled, as if the very walls had recognized the weight of the moment before anyone inside did. The spectators, once amused, now sat rigid in their seats, eyes locked on the old man standing at the defendant's table. Judge Robert Calloway cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. His fingers, which had been drumming lazily against the polished wood of his bench, stopped entirely. The prosecutor, Ethan Barker, felt his confidence falter for the first time since stepping into the courtroom that morning. He had expected defiance, maybe even desperation, but not this presence, not this voice. "Your Honor," the defendant repeated, his voice unwavering. No one dared to speak. The stenographer's hands hovered over her keyboard, her fingers frozen mid-stroke. The bailiff, arms once crossed in casual amusement, now stood stiff as a soldier awaiting orders. Even the jury, who had up until now been only half listening, leaned forward in their seats. Because they knew, they all knew. Yet somehow they hadn't realized it until just now. Morgan Freeman stood before them, the man whose voice had narrated history itself, the very same voice that had spoken of kings and presidents, of triumphs and tragedies, of human nature in its most profound and unfiltered form, was now here, in this courtroom, accused of a petty crime. And the entire room had laughed at him. Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses, masking his sudden unease with a cough. "Let's keep the theatrics to a minimum, sir," he said, though his voice lacked its usual iron edge. "You've been charged with criminal trespassing. The evidence is clear. Let's not waste time pretending this is anything more than that." Freeman exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "Pretending?" he echoed, his tone as steady as the foundations of the courthouse itself. The judge shifted in his seat. "Yes," he said, regaining some of his authority. "This is a simple case. You unlawfully entered private property. You ignored posted signs. Cameras caught you on the premises. The prosecution has presented a clear narrative. This isn't a moral debate, it's the law." For the first time, Morgan Freeman smiled, just barely. "A clear narrative?" he mused, the hint of something knowing in his tone. The prosecutor, sensing an opening, stepped forward, eager to regain control. "Exactly," Barker said, his voice taking on a practiced confidence. "Your Honor, this man deliberately disregarded legal boundaries. The law is blind to status, and we cannot allow exceptions. The footage speaks for itself. Mr. Freeman knowingly entered a restricted area without permission. There is no ambiguity here." Morgan Freeman turned to face the prosecutor fully, his eyes calm but piercing. "And what exactly was this restricted area?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet authority. Barker blinked. "The defendant entered a privately owned lot on the corner of 5th and Madison," he stated, flipping through his notes. "The property was purchased by Summit Developments 2 years ago and is currently pending construction for a commercial plaza." Freeman nodded as if considering the answer. "Interesting," he murmured. The courtroom waited, tension winding tighter with each passing second. Then Freeman turned back to the judge, and for the first time, the warmth left his voice entirely. "Tell me, Your Honor," he said, his words deliberate, controlled. "How long have you worked in this courthouse?" Judge Calloway furrowed his brow. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Humor me," Freeman said. Calloway exhaled, irritated. 26 years, Freeman nodded. "Then perhaps you'll recall that for 35 years that same corner of 5th and Madison was not a privately owned lot." Barker frowned. "What does that have to do with your trespassing charge?" Morgan Freeman turned, and when he spoke next, his voice rippled through the courtroom like a distant storm rolling in. "Because before Summit Developments bought that land, before they bulldozed what was there, before they decided it was restricted to the very people who built its foundation, that corner was a community center. And for decades, I stood in that very place teaching children how to read." A murmur spread through the gallery. Judge Calloway stiffened, his grip tightening around his gavel. Prosecutor Barker's jaw clenched. "And tell me," Freeman continued, voice steady, "which is the greater offense, returning to a place where I once gave knowledge freely, or erasing its history for the sake of another corporate skyscraper?" Barker opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, he hesitated. Freeman let the silence settle. Then he turned back to the judge. "I did not climb fences, I did not break locks, I did not cause damage," he stated plainly. "I stepped onto an open lot, one I have known longer than its current owners, and if this court believes that is a crime, then so be it." Silence. Judge Calloway clenched his jaw. Prosecutor Barker flipped through his files, desperate to regain his footing. The courtroom, which had been so sure just minutes ago, now wasn't so certain at all. And then, the prosecutor made his first mistake. Regardless of what that place used to be, the law is clear, Barker said, forcing authority back into his tone. You do not own that land, and nostalgia is not a legal defense. Freeman chuckled, not in amusement but in understanding. You're right, he said. Nostalgia isn't a defense, but you've made one fatal assumption. Barker narrowed his eyes. Oh? And what's that? Morgan Freeman slowly reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded document. His eyes met Barker's. That I don't own that land. The entire courtroom gasped, and in that moment the prosecution realized they had just lost control of this case. The courtroom stood still, every breath held in anticipation. Morgan Freeman's hand, steady as time itself, held the document aloft, a single folded sheet of paper that now seemed heavier than anything else in the room. The edges were slightly worn, a testament to the history it carried. The prosecutor, Ethan Barker, squinted at it, suspicion flashing in his eyes. His fingers twitched as if itching to snatch it away, to dismantle whatever trick this old man thought he was playing. Judge Robert Calloway cleared his throat, regaining his composure. The momentary shock was gone, replaced by hardened skepticism. Mr. Freeman, as he said, his voice firm, unless that document contains a deed with your name on it, I fail to see its relevance. Freeman's lips curled, not into a smirk, but something softer, something far more dangerous. A knowing smile. Then allow me to enlighten the court, he said smoothly, unfolding the paper with the deliberate patience of a man who had spent a lifetime teaching others the value of waiting for the truth. A murmur rippled through the gallery as the first words became visible. Deed of transfer. Harlem Literacy Initiative. The room shifted, the weight of the revelation settling into every corner. The stenographer, who had spent the entire trial typing without thought, let out an audible gasp. The bailiff leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing in scrutiny. The jury exchanged glances, whispers passing between them like wildfire. But it was Prosecutor Barker who reacted most viscerally. His shoulders stiffened, his lips parted slightly, as though his brain was trying to keep up with what his eyes had just registered. This can't be right, he muttered under his breath. Morgan Freeman glanced at him, the weight of years of wisdom and experience behind his gaze. Oh, but it is. Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses, squinting as Freeman extended the document toward the bench. A bailiff retrieved it, placing it before the judge with almost ceremonial care. Silence hung in the air as Calloway read the first few lines, and then the shift happened. His fingers tightened against the edge of the paper. His jaw locked. The arrogance, the certainty that had been in his voice just moments ago, evaporated. He looked up, his gaze finding Freeman's. Explain this, he said, his voice quieter now. Freeman didn't hesitate. 37 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the courtroom, I helped fund a literacy center for children in underprivileged communities, many of whom had nowhere else to turn. We built it brick by brick, not just with money, but with time, with effort, with belief. A hush swept over the courtroom. The spectators who had laughed at him earlier now sat rigid, listening. For decades, Freeman continued, that building stood as a beacon of hope. I taught there. I mentored there. I watched generations of children learn to read their first words within its walls. He let those words settle before speaking again. And when the city sold the land to Summit Developments, they assumed they were purchasing it free of any attachments. He turned toward Barker now, watching the prosecutor's mask of confidence begin to crack. They were wrong. Barker's breath hitched. That land, Freeman said, was placed under the protection of the Harlem Literacy Initiative, a nonprofit with my name still listed as one of its trustees. Prosecutor Barker's hands clenched into fists. He flipped furiously through his notes, looking for something, anything that could counteract what had just been revealed. That's impossible, he snapped. If that were true, we would have seen it in the property records. But he stopped himself, because he knew. He hadn't checked. Why would he? It had been a simple case, an easy win. A nameless old man caught trespassing, nothing more. The arrogance had cost him. Freeman tilted his head slightly, watching the realization dawn on the prosecutor's face. "Did you research the land's history, Mr. Barker?" he asked, his tone not condescending but measured. Barker's mouth opened, then closed, because there was only one correct answer to that question, and they both knew what it was. The judge let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping against the edge of his desk. Once in thought, twice in frustration. "So what you're telling me," Calloway said, speaking slowly, carefully, "is that Summit Developments purchased this land without realizing a nonprofit organization still held legal rights to it." Freeman nodded once. "And that means," he continued, "that this case isn't about trespassing." He turned back toward Barker. "It's about corporate negligence." A visible ripple spread through the crowd. The murmurs grew louder. The stenographer, who had been typing furiously, paused mid-sentence. The bailiff, usually impassive, exchanged a glance with one of the jurors, because the courtroom had just realized something else. This wasn't a trial about an old man stepping where he shouldn't. This was a trial about who truly had the right to be there, and Morgan Freeman had just rewritten the entire narrative. Judge Calloway set the document down, his face unreadable. His gaze flickered between Freeman and Barker, his mind no longer weighing guilt, but something far heavier. Barker, scrambling to regain control, took a step forward. "Your Honor, Enough." The word wasn't shouted, wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Calloway leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Mr. Barker," he said evenly, "I will ask you one question." The prosecutor swallowed. "Did you or did you not verify all legal ownership rights to that land before proceeding with these charges?" Barker's throat bobbed. His lips parted, but no words came out. Because what could he say? If he lied, he perjured himself. If he told the truth, he admitted his incompetence. And either answer meant one thing: he had already lost. Freeman exhaled, watching the prosecutor's world collapse in real time. Then he stepped forward, placed his hands on the table, and said the words that would seal the fate of this trial forever. "Your Honor, before we discuss my alleged crime, perhaps we should discuss theirs." The courtroom erupted. The courtroom erupted. A wave of murmurs, gasps, and hurried whispers rippled through the gallery like a storm gaining momentum. The once dismissive spectators, who had laughed at the sight of an old man on trial, now leaned forward, their expression shifting from amusement to intrigue, some to outright disbelief. Judge Robert Calloway struck his gavel twice, demanding order, but the energy in the room had changed. The case had changed. This was no longer about trespassing. Freeman had shifted the entire battlefield. Across the room, Prosecutor Ethan Barker clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the edge of the table like a man grasping for control he no longer had. "Your Honor," Freeman continued, his voice unwavering, "before this court condemns me for stepping onto that land, shouldn't we ask why the rightful stakeholders, those who built that center, who kept it alive, were never consulted when it was sold?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Judge Calloway, for the first time in the trial, hesitated. His gavel hand rested motionless on the bench, his knuckles whitening slightly. "Mr. Barker," he said, shifting his gaze to the prosecutor, "is this true?" Barker exhaled sharply, trying to mask his frustration with a veneer of control. He shuffled through his files, though everyone in the room knew he wouldn't find the answer he wanted. "Your Honor," Barker said, voice tight, "the property was legally acquired by Summit Developments. The defendant's personal history with the land does not change the fact that he had no right to enter." Freeman tilted his head slightly, watching the prosecutor like a teacher waiting for a student to recognize their mistake. "And yet," Freeman said smoothly, "you just admitted you never verified whether my organization still had any claim to the land." Barker froze. "Which means," Freeman continued, stepping forward, "the true crime here may not be mine, but yours." A collective intake of breath filled the room. The judge's gaze flickered toward the deed that still rested on his bench, the document that no one had expected to see. "Mr. Freeman," Calloway said, adjusting his glasses, "are you telling this court that Summit Developments failed to clear this purchase legally?" "I'm saying," Freeman replied, "that the Harlem Literacy Initiative never signed away its rights to that land. And if Summit assumed ownership without due diligence, then the real legal question we should be asking is, who is actually trespassing?" Barker blanched. The whispers in the gallery grew louder. For years, cases had passed through this very courtroom without question. Minor charges, corporate acquisitions, legal transactions rubber-stamped by bureaucratic process. But now, for the first time in a long time, the system itself was being questioned. "Your Honor," Barker said quickly, "the defendant is attempting to deflect from the original charges. Regardless of property disputes, he was still on private land without permission." "A land that might not be theirs to begin with?" Freeman countered smoothly. Judge Calloway exhaled through his nose, his patience fraying at the edges. "Enough," he said, rubbing his temple. "Do you have proof, Mr. Freeman, that your organization's stake in the land is still valid?" Without a word, Freeman reached into his coat and pulled out a second document. The room stilled. The bailiff moved forward, taking the document and handing it to the judge. Calloway scanned the first page, and his expression shifted immediately. Barker leaned forward, straining to see what was written. "Your Honor," Freeman said, voice calm but firm, "this is the last recorded legal agreement between the Harlem Literacy Initiative and the City of New York. It states that any sale of the land must be reviewed by the initiative's board, of which I am still a member." Judge Calloway's brows knitted together. His fingers traced the signature at the bottom of the page. "And yet," Freeman continued, his gaze settling on Barker, "no one from our board was ever contacted. No consent was given, meaning Summit Developments did not complete this purchase legally, meaning their claim is invalid." The room exploded into chaos. Barker's face drained of color. His carefully prepared case was crumbling in real time. He turned to the judge, scrambling. This is a diversion," he stammered. "We need time to verify these documents. This doesn't change the fact that—" "It changes everything, Mr. Barker," Judge Calloway cut him off. The prosecutor swallowed hard. This wasn't just a lost case anymore. This was career-damaging negligence. Calloway leaned back in his chair, staring at Freeman as if seeing him for the first time. "Mr. Freeman," he said carefully, "are you requesting that this court halt proceedings on your case to investigate the legality of Summit Development's land acquisition?" Freeman nodded. "That would be the logical course of action, wouldn't it?" The judge rubbed his chin, deep in thought. Then he did something no one in the room expected. He turned to the bailiff. "Summon a court officer," he instructed. "I want those records pulled immediately." Barker stiffened. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "No, Mr. Barker," Calloway interjected. "What's irregular is trying a man for trespassing on land he may still own rights to, and I won't be the judge who rubber stamps a case built on incomplete information." A single knock of the gavel echoed through the room. "Court is in recess," Calloway declared. The gallery exploded with renewed energy. Spectators talked in hurried tones, some glancing at Freeman with a newfound sense of admiration, others looking at Barker as if watching a man drown. Barker's hand shook slightly as he gathered his papers. Freeman, meanwhile, remained composed. He turned to leave the defendant's table. But just before he did, he leaned in slightly toward Barker. "Mr. Barker," he said, his voice just loud enough for the prosecutor to hear, "next time you take a case, do your homework." He stepped away, leaving Barker staring at his own reflection in the polished wood of the prosecution's table. As Freeman exited the courtroom, he passed Judge Calloway, who for the first time that day looked at him without condescension, but with something else entirely. Respect. But the fight wasn't over yet, and the next battle wouldn't be in a courtroom. It would be against the system itself. The courtroom buzzed with an energy that had not existed when the trial began. Morgan Freeman, once dismissed as a simple trespasser, had unraveled an entirely different case, one that no one, not even the judge, had anticipated. As the court recessed to investigate the land ownership records, a subtle yet unmistakable shift in power had taken place. The once smirking prosecutor, Ethan Barker, now sat hunched over his files, rifling through documents he should have examined long before stepping into court. His confidence was gone, replaced by the weight of a realization he could not afford to admit. He had made a catastrophic mistake. Judge Robert Calloway, a man who prided himself on control, was no longer in control. For the first time in years, he was forced to question the very system he had upheld. And Freeman? He sat calmly, hands folded, watching, waiting. As the judge declared a recess, the courtroom doors swung open, and Freeman walked out into a storm of flashing cameras. Journalists, who had barely paid attention to this case at the beginning, were now clamoring for a statement. Microphones extended toward him like weapons, each reporter eager to capture the words of the man who had just exposed a legal blind spot. "Mr. Freeman, did you know about the illegal sale before today?" one reporter called out. "What will you do if the court overturns the sale?" Another pushed. "Are you planning to sue Summit Developments?" Freeman paused at the top of the courthouse steps, looking at the sea of reporters, cameras, and microphones before him. He had been in the public eye many times before, but this was different. This was personal. "The real question," he said, his voice carrying over the noise, "is not what I will do, but what we, as a society, will allow." The reporters fell silent. How many communities have lost their homes, their history, their safe spaces, all because someone with more money decided they didn't matter? Freeman continued. And how many more will be erased if no one stands up and says, "Enough"? The cameras clicked furiously. The journalists scribbled notes. Freeman had just shifted the conversation. This was no longer about his trial. This was about all the forgotten people who had been displaced by a system that valued profits over people. And suddenly, it wasn't just his fight anymore. Across the city, inside a glass-walled office overlooking Manhattan, the executives at Summit Developments were scrambling. The CEO, Richard Langford, stood by the window, phone pressed tightly to his ear, listening as his legal team frantically tried to salvage the situation. "How the hell did this happen?" he snapped. "You told me the sale was airtight." On the other end of the line, his top attorney struggled to find the right words. We didn't anticipate Freeman still being involved with the literacy initiative. We assumed..." "You assumed?" Langford's voice was a razor's edge. "We are about to be exposed on national television because you assumed?" He turned, glaring at the room full of his top executives, all of whom were watching the live news feed of Freeman addressing the press. Damage control now. But even as the crisis team scrambled, Langford knew this wasn't going away quietly, because Morgan Freeman had just made sure of that. Back at the courthouse, Judge Calloway was growing restless. He sat behind his bench, waiting as court officers retrieved the property records. Every passing second chipped away at the confidence he had once had in this case. When the officers returned, their faces confirmed what Calloway already suspected. "Your Honor," one of them said, placing a thick folder on the desk, "we reviewed the sale records. The Harlem Literacy Initiative was never properly consulted before the transfer. Legally, the property's status is unclear." A tense silence followed. Freeman said nothing. He didn't need to. Barker, on the other hand, was unraveling. "Your Honor," he tried, his voice lacking its previous authority, "this is irrelevant to the charges at hand." "Irrelevant?" Calloway cut him off. His patience had reached its limit. "You attempted to prosecute a man for trespassing on land that, for all we know, may still belong to his organization. Do you understand what that means, Mr. Barker?" The prosecutor swallowed. "It means," Calloway continued, his tone edged with something dangerously close to regret, "we may have just spent an entire trial trying the wrong person." The jurors stiffened at those words. From the moment they had taken their seats, this case had seemed simple. A wealthy developer, a faceless trespasser, an inevitable conviction. But now, they weren't so sure anymore. Freeman had done something no defendant had done before. He had turned the tables. Instead of being the one under scrutiny, he had forced the court to examine itself. In an attempt to salvage their reputation, Summit Developments issued a press release within the hour. "We deeply respect Mr. Freeman's contributions to literacy and education. We are working to resolve this matter in a way that honors his legacy while ensuring the community's needs are met. It was corporate speak for panic. They knew what was coming. Even as the court crumbled around him, Barker refused to surrender. This is a delay tactic, he argued. Regardless of ownership, Freeman still stepped onto private property without permission. Freeman raised an eyebrow, his patience finally reaching its end. "And tell me, Mr. Barker," he said, "if I entered my own home after someone else stole the keys, would you charge me with breaking and entering?" The words hit like a hammer. The prosecutor had no response. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, watching as the weight of Freeman's words sank in for everyone. He exhaled as if coming to terms with what needed to be done. "I will issue my ruling in the morning," he said finally. "Court is adjourned." The gavel struck. The trial wasn't over yet, but for the first time, the outcome no longer seemed so certain. The courthouse doors creaked open, spilling Morgan Freeman into a sea of flashing cameras and eager reporters. The storm of media attention had reached its peak. Just days ago, this case had been a simple trespassing charge, a routine, forgettable trial. Now it had transformed into something much larger, a public reckoning over corruption, corporate greed, and the erasure of history. Freeman knew this fight had left the courtroom. And now the real battle had begun. The moment Summit Development's name was linked to the trial, everything changed. Within hours, protests erupted across Harlem and Lower Manhattan. Activists and former students of the Literacy Center rallied outside Summit's headquarters, holding up signs that read, "This land belongs to the people. Justice for Harlem Literacy Initiative. A community is not for sale." News stations ran continuous coverage, replaying Freeman's speech outside the courthouse. Social media exploded. Every major outlet was now demanding answers from Summit, from the prosecutor's office, even from the judge himself. Judge Calloway, watching the chaos unfold from his office window, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The law was supposed to be clear-cut, but what happened when the law collided with morality? Inside the sleek, towering offices of Summit Development's CEO Richard Langford was furious. "How the hell did we let it get this far?" he bellowed, pacing in front of his crisis team. His head of public relations, Victoria Hale, folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "We underestimated him," she admitted. "We thought this would disappear quietly. Instead, he turned it into a movement." Langford stopped pacing, his fists clenching. "So what do we do?" Hale inhaled deeply. "We find leverage," she said. The room fell silent. Langford's eyes darkened. "Dig into his past," he ordered. "There must be something we can use against him." It didn't take long for Summit's legal team to move. The next morning, a confidential report mysteriously leaked, allegations that Freeman had mishandled funds from the Harlem Literacy Initiative years ago. Headline: Morgan Freeman under scrutiny, financial irregularities surface in nonprofit records. The corporate smear campaign had begun. Outside the courthouse, a different set of reporters were now shouting accusatory questions. "Mr. Freeman, did you funnel money from the Literacy Center? Are you using this case to cover past corruption? Did you profit from the very land you claim to protect?" Freeman stood at the top of the courthouse steps, facing the storm head-on. Then he smiled, not because he was amused, but because he had expected this. The following morning, Freeman walked into the courtroom with absolute calm. Across the room, prosecutor Ethan Barker looked revitalized. The allegations against Freeman had given him an opening, a chance to recover from the disaster this trial had become. "Your Honor," Barker said, standing confidently, "new information has come to light regarding the defendant's financial dealings with the Harlem Literacy Initiative. I move to introduce this as evidence." "Denied." The courtroom went still. Judge Calloway barely looked up from the file in front of him. Barker blinked. "Your Honor?" Calloway exhaled sharply, shutting the file and leveling a gaze at the prosecutor. "Mr. Barker," he said, "did you honestly believe I wouldn't look into these allegations before today's proceedings?" The prosecutor shifted in his stance. "These reports were fabricated, selectively edited from a routine audit report that found no wrongdoing." Calloway's voice grew colder. And the fact that this leak just so happened to emerge when Summit Developments was backed into a corner, well, let's just say the timing is suspect at best. The jury stirred, whispering amongst themselves. Summit's desperate ploy had backfired. Freeman sat, completely unfazed. He had seen men like Langford before, men who thought they could rewrite history to fit their own convenience. But this time, history had fought back. Judge Calloway rubbed his temples, the weight of the trial pressing down on him. This court was called upon to rule on a simple trespassing charge, he said, but it is clear that what we are really dealing with is a failure of due diligence, a failure of ethics, and perhaps a failure of the system itself. The courtroom hung onto every word. As it stands, Calloway continued, the legitimacy of Summit Development's land ownership is in question. Therefore, I have no choice but to... The doors burst open. A court officer rushed forward, handing Calloway a folder stamped URGENT. Calloway scanned the first few pages. His jaw tightened. His expression darkened. The tension in the room crackled like an approaching storm. Then he looked up, right at Morgan Freeman. "Mr. Freeman," he said slowly, "I think you're going to want to hear this." Judge Robert Calloway sat in silence, the weight of the urgent file pressing down on him like an iron gavel. The truth was undeniable. The land sale had been rushed, the necessary approvals never obtained, and Summit Developments had knowingly ignored legal procedures to fast-track their project. The case that had begun as a petty trespassing charge had transformed into something far greater, a battle for justice, integrity, and the truth. Calloway sighed deeply, looking toward Ethan Barker, the once confident prosecutor who now sat hunched over, his hands clasped tightly together. "Mr. Barker," Calloway said, his tone heavier than before, "you pursued this case with conviction, but it seems that conviction was misplaced." Barker swallowed hard. His career had been built on winning, but now he realized this wasn't a case to be won. It was a lesson to be learned. Slowly, he turned to face Freeman. For the first time, his expression wasn't one of arrogance, but of regret. "Mr. Freeman," Barker said, his voice quieter, "I was wrong. You weren't trespassing. You were standing on ground that was already yours." Freeman studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod, not of forgiveness, but of understanding. Judge Calloway exhaled. Then, in a clear, decisive voice, he delivered the words that would echo beyond the walls of the courtroom. Case dismissed. The gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in something else. Something rare in a place where justice often felt like a cold, distant concept, a sense of rightness. As Freeman walked out of the courthouse, the cameras flashed, the world watching. But he didn't speak for the headlines. He spoke for the people who had been silenced for far too long. "The measure of a society isn't in its wealth or power," he said. "It's in how it treats those it thinks have none." Through this story, we realize that dignity cannot be measured in dollars, and respect should never be reserved for the privileged. Morgan Freeman didn't just fight for himself, he fought for the forgotten, the displaced, and the overlooked. The real value of a person isn't in what they own, but in how they uplift others. Power fades, wealth shifts, but the impact of integrity echoes far beyond a single moment. True justice isn't about the law alone, it's about humanity. And in the end, the greatest battles aren't fought in courtrooms, but in hearts willing to change.